Before dawn on August 17, 1942, Eagle Farm didn't feel like a famous airfield. It felt like a workshop that had been dragged into a war it wasn't ready for. The concrete was stained with oil and rainwater. The air carried that sharp, metallic bite you only get around hot tools and exhaust. Somewhere in the darkness, a generator coughed, caught, and settled into a rough, steady growl. Like a tired animal refusing to lie down. Under the wing of a Douglas A-20 Havoc, Captain Paul Pappy Gunn crouched low, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from a welding torch. The sparks looked bright and innocent for an instant, then died against the aircraft's skin like insects hitting a lamp. Gunn didn't blink. He watched the seam being laid down as if he were watching the edge of a knife being sharpened. If you had met him that morning without context, you might not have guessed he was about to reshape the way an entire air force fought at sea. He didn't carry himself like a polished hero. He carried himself like a man who had been awake too long, who had lived long enough to stop trusting slogans. He was older than many of the pilots around him, and in the Pacific, age came with a particular weight. It meant you'd seen enough wreckage to know how fast luck runs out. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about speeches or medals. He was thinking about convoys. Japanese convoys sliding into New Guinea like a slow, unstoppable tide. Ships packed with troops and fuel and ammunition, moving under cloud and rain, feeding a campaign that would grind Allied soldiers into the mud for months to come. Every transport that reached shore meant more fighting on the ground. More men dying in places where the jungle swallowed bodies and names alike. And the most infuriating part, the part that made mechanics swear under their breath and pilots stare at the floor, was that the Allies were already attacking those convoys. They just weren't killing them. High-altitude bombing looked clean on paper. It made commanders feel in control. The bomber formations were neat. The numbers were tidy. Drop from thousands of feet, keep the crew out of the worst of shipboard fire, and let gravity do the rest. But ships were narrow targets, moving targets. Wind and cloud and sea glare turned precision into a cruel joke. A bomb that missed by 50 meters might as well miss by 50 miles. The convoy kept moving. The enemy kept arriving. So crews tried to solve it the hard way. They came down lower. And down low, everything changed. At low altitude, you couldn't pretend the ocean was empty space. It became a surface you could almost touch, a mirror that threw light into your eyes and hid distance. At low altitude, shipboard gunners didn't need elaborate calculations. They needed seconds, just a handful of them, to track you and fill your path with steel. And an airplane, no matter how brave its crew, is a fragile thing when it meets sustained fire. Aluminum skin, fuel lines, control cables, hydraulics. A few hits in the wrong place and the aircraft becomes a falling object with a pilot still inside it. That was the reality behind the tired phrase, losing aircraft faster than replacements arrived. It wasn't a slogan. It was the living rhythm of the war. Plane goes out. Plane doesn't come back. Crew doesn't come back. Another crew moves into their bunks like someone filling a vacancy at a factory. Gunn had watched enough missions to understand the problem wasn't courage. Courage was plentiful. The problem was the approach. If you wanted to hit a ship at point-blank range, if you wanted to skip a bomb across the water and slam it into the side of a hull, you had to survive the run-in long enough to release. That meant you had to break the ship's ability to fight back before you arrived over the target. You had to make the gunners duck. You had to make them blind. You had to make them stop. The A-20 Havoc already carried forward guns, but they were smaller caliber, built for other assumptions. Against ships, those lighter rounds often did little more than punch holes and throw sparks. They made noise. Noise didn't win this fight. Gunn wanted weight. He wanted 50 caliber guns. Big, heavy, savage weapons designed to tear through metal and bodies with blunt force. He wanted the kind of fire that didn't politely suggest the enemy leave his position, but forced him out with fear. The easiest way to get those guns wasn't a supply requisition. In the Southwest Pacific, supply requisitions were dreams. The easiest way was salvage. Wrecked fighters sitting in the sun, their engines blown, their pilots dead or gone. Silent reminders that war's waste could sometimes be turned into advantage. Gunn had a different kind of respect for wreckage. He looked at broken aircraft and didn't only see loss. He saw usable parts. He saw the machine gun still intact, still oiled, still capable of firing. He saw a way to turn death into something that might prevent more death. So he did it. He took the guns. He built a steel frame inside the A-20's nose compartment, and he mounted 50 caliber machine guns where the bombardier used to sit. It was a crude surgery. It felt wrong to anyone who had been trained to think of aircraft as sacred designs. You didn't remove stations and replace them with brute force. You didn't treat a bomber like a gun platform. You didn't turn something meant for altitude into something that hunted at treetop height. But Gunn didn't care what an aircraft was meant to be. He cared what it could do now. The first test flight was a warning from physics itself. Adding guns and ammunition to the nose shifted the aircraft's center of gravity forward. The airplane wanted to pitch down like it was trying to bury itself. The pilot had to wrestle it through takeoff, and for a moment it looked like the aircraft might simply refuse to fly. In war, refuse to fly isn't a technical problem. It's a death sentence. Gunn listened to the pilot's report without excuses. He didn't blame anyone. He didn't argue. He simply went back to work and fought the problem the only way field mechanics ever have. By moving weight, trimming, rebalancing, adjusting anything and everything until the aircraft stopped trying to kill its own crew. That process wasn't glamorous. It was hours of sweat, knuckles split on metal edges, arguments over millimeters, long nights of getting it wrong and then getting it less wrong. It was the kind of work that makes your world shrink to bolts and brackets, because if you think too much about the consequences, you'll freeze. The second test flight was still ugly, but it flew. The pilot described it with a word that sounded like a curse and a compliment at the same time. Angry. The airplane flew like it was angry. It wanted to dive. It wanted to fight. It wanted to punish anyone who treated it casually. Angry meant alive. Around that time, a new commander's shadow stretched across 5th Air Force. General George Guinea didn't arrive with miracles. He arrived with a willingness to accept risk that would make peacetime engineers flinch. Guinea had inherited a mess. Long distances, harsh weather, limited resources, a relentless enemy, and he understood something crucial. Doctrine didn't win wars by itself. Adaptation did. He saw Gunn's experiments and didn't ask whether they were pretty. He asked whether they could kill ships and save crews. Guinea wanted proof. Gunn delivered it in the only language war respects. Results. Modified A-20s went out on low-level strikes and came back with stories that sounded like lies until you saw the bullet holes in the aircraft's skin and the empty bunks that weren't as empty as before. They came in low, guns hammering, pinning defenses long enough for bombs to hit. They didn't become invincible, but they became survivable. And survivable was everything. For a brief moment, it looked like the A-20 might be the answer. Then geography reminded everyone why New Guinea was called a campaign, not a battle. The A-20 had limits, range, payload. The distance to targets across mountains and weather that turned flight plans into jokes. Gunn needed a bigger platform, something with more room for weapons, more fuel margin, more bomb load, something that could do the job and still come home with a cough of reserve fuel instead of a dead engine. He chose the B-25 Mitchell. The B-25 was a medium bomber with a reputation for toughness and a wide range of roles, but it was still shaped by old assumptions. You bomb from above. You keep your nose glass clear for a bombardier. You treat forward guns as secondary. The B-25 could strafe shore, but it wasn't built to be a forward-firing monster. Gunn didn't see the B-25 as what it was. He saw it as what it could be. The conversion began the same way. Remove what the role demanded, replace it with what the war required. The bombardier's equipment came out. The nose guns were rethought. The solid nose concept took shape. Forward-firing 50s mounted where a man used to sit with a bomb sight. Additional guns were added along the fuselage. Cheek mounts, side mounts, wherever the structure could be reinforced and the muzzle blast could be managed without tearing the aircraft apart. The ground crews had their own name for these kinds of ideas. It wasn't flattering. It was the kind of nickname crews give to a project that might kill them. Something like folly, something like madness, something like the captain's dream. But even skeptics understood what was happening when they watched those forward gun mounts come together. Each gun was heavy. Ammunition was heavier. Metal brackets flexed under the load. Every rivet became a question. Every weld became a promise. Hold, please hold, because men will trust you with their lives. In the field, you don't have wind tunnels. You don't have months of stress testing. You have the most unforgiving test environment ever invented. Combat. The first B-25 strafer prototype was nose-heavy and stubborn. Pilots described takeoff like dragging a loaded cart uphill. Control forces were heavy. Trim settings mattered like never before. But once airborne, once stabilized, the aircraft became something else. A flying destroyer, not a metaphor, a function. At low level, a B-25 with concentrated forward guns could put a storm of .50 caliber fire onto a ship's deck in the seconds before bomb release. It could suppress defenses in a way that changed the odds of survival for every aircraft behind it. It could transform an approach that used to be a near-certain death sentence into something a crew could attempt and expect to live through, if luck stayed near them long enough. This is the part that people like to frame as experts versus rebel. It makes a neat story. But the truth was colder. There were no villains in lab coats twirling mustaches. The engineers who objected weren't evil. Their job was to prevent aircraft from killing their own crews. Their job was to keep designs within safe margins. They had every reason to worry about center of gravity shifts, structural fatigue, skin buckling around mounts, muzzle blast damage, vibration and recoil stressing already overworked airframes. In peacetime, they would have been right to stop it. But war is not peacetime. War asks for outcomes, not elegance. When field reports began to spread, mechanic to mechanic, squadron to squadron, guns modifications went from one crazy prototype to a thing we do now. Crews worked punishing hours, converting every B-25 they could get their hands on. They lived inside hangars and ate when they remembered. They measured their days not in sunrise and sunset, but in how many mounts they could fit and how many test firings they could complete before the next mission. And hovering above all of it was that other war, the private war Gunn carried. His family was trapped in Japanese captivity in the Philippines. A wife and children behind wire, on thin rations, surviving on luck and the fragile protection of international attention that could vanish at any moment. That knowledge makes a man impatient with excuses. It makes him see every delay as another day his family might not survive. It makes him listen to warnings and hear only one thing: not now. By late February 1943, the pieces were in place for a test no one could postpone. A Japanese convoy was moving. The convoy wasn't just ships. It was a decision. It was Japan saying, "We will reinforce New Guinea, and you will not stop us." It was thousands of troops and tons of supplies moving over open water in an ocean that had become, more than any jungle trail, the lifeline of the campaign. Allied intelligence picked up the movement. Messages, patterns, a picture emerging. 8 transports escorted by destroyers heading toward Leh. A large force for a region where every ship mattered. And the weather, monsoon season, seemed like an ally for the Japanese. Low clouds, heavy rain, shifting visibility. The kind of conditions that made high-altitude bombing miserable and made fighters struggle to cover. The Japanese were betting that weather would do what guns could not: keep Allied aircraft away. The Allies knew they had a window measured in hours. Heavy bombers went first. They always did. They were the blunt instrument that could reach out, hit from altitude, scatter formations, and force escorts to reveal their patterns. On March 2nd, our aircraft made contact and attacked through breaks in cloud. Bombs fell. Water erupted. Ships maneuvered hard. The convoy kept moving. Later analysis would confirm what crews already knew in their bones. High-altitude bombing against moving ships often produced spectacular sprays and very few kills. But the first day wasn't about sinking ships. It was about shaping the battlefield, breaking cohesion, forcing the convoy to turn and scatter and exhaust itself, making them burn fuel, lose formation, and cling closer to coastlines where they could be trapped. That night, briefing rooms felt like waiting rooms before surgery. Crews listened to plans in silence that wasn't calm. It was the silence of men who know the plan will work only if luck doesn't betray them. The plan for the next morning was simple in the way only desperate plans are. Hit the convoy from above to pull fire upward, then come in low, so low it feels insane. Use strafers to pin the gunners, skip bomb at mast-head height, get out fast, get out before fighters arrive, get out before the escorts reorganize, get out before flak finds the cable you can't replace in midair. No one in that room could pretend it wasn't dangerous. No one could pretend they were likely to feel heroic. The only promise was this. If the convoy reached Leh, the war on the ground would turn worse. If they destroyed it, they might shorten the campaign by months and save lives that would otherwise be spent in mud and malaria and close-range gunfire. Morning came too quickly. It always does. On March 3rd, aircraft assembled into the kind of strike force that looks impressive on paper, but feels fragile when you're inside it. Fighters for cover, bombers for distraction and pressure, low-level attackers for the kill. Pilots climbed, leveled, descended, and leveled again, the sky turning from gray to a harsh, washed-out daylight that made everything too visible. Over the sea, there was nowhere to hide. When the convoy came into view, it didn't look like a cinematic line of targets waiting politely. It looked like a moving machine. Wakes spreading, escorts weaving, guns already aimed at the sky as if the ships had been born, expecting to be attacked. The first waves hit. Explosions from above. Flak bursts around heavy bombers, black puffs that hung for a moment like bruises on the sky. Tracers reached upward, desperate and fast. The convoy's gunners were forced to look up and shoot up. Then the low-level attackers came in. At mast-head height, the world becomes violent and small. Your eyes lock onto the nearest ship not because it's the most important target, but because it's the one you will hit if you blink. The sea rushes under you in a blur. The aircraft feels less like it's flying and more like it's sliding on invisible rails. The cockpit is a tight box of noise. The radio crackles with clipped voices. You can hear your own breathing through the mask. You can feel the aircraft's vibration in your teeth. And you can see the guns. Shipboard guns look different when you're 50 feet above the water. They aren't abstract defenses anymore. They are men behind shields, hands moving, barrels tracking. They are the immediate reason you might not go home. The forward guns open, and the sound is not like individual shots. It is a sustained tearing, like cloth being ripped, except the cloth is metal and the ripping is done by heavy bullets arriving in a continuous stream. The rounds strike the water short of the target and walk forward, kicking up lines of spray. Then they rake across superstructures, decks, bridges, anywhere a man might stand and aim. The point is not to sink the ship with bullets. The point is to remove the ship's ability to defend itself long enough for bombs to hit. There is a moment in these attacks, brief, razor-thin, where the convoy's defenses are shocked, pinned, or overwhelmed. It is in that moment that bombs come in low. Some skip, bouncing on the surface like stones thrown hard by a furious hand, slamming into hulls where armor and watertight integrity are weakest. Some detonate close enough to rupture plating and flood compartments. Fires start where fuel and cargo meet heat and fragmentation. A ship slows. Another lists. Another drops out of formation entirely, becoming a wounded animal in open water. And once a ship is wounded, it draws attention like blood draws sharks. Multiple aircraft attack from different directions. The convoy's escorts try to screen and protect, but they are fighting the wrong war. Destroyers are built to fight ships and submarines, to maneuver and fire at targets on or under the water. They are not built to stop a coordinated, low-level air assault. Their guns can hit aircraft, yes, but only if they can aim, and only if the aircraft gives them time. The strafers do not give them time. By mid-morning, the convoy's organized movement begins to break. Ships scatter across miles of ocean. Some are burning. Some are dead in the water. Escorts attempt rescue and defense at the same time, a cruel contradiction. You can't save survivors and defend yourself effectively when aircraft return in waves. You can't form a perfect screen when each ship has its own emergency. And the aircraft do return. They land, rearm, refuel, and come back out with the same hard logic. The ocean is wide, but the targets are still there, smoking and limping. The destruction that follows becomes one of the defining moments of the campaign. Over the course of March 2nd to March 4th, the convoy is effectively annihilated. Transports sunk, destroyers lost, troops intended for New Guinea swallowed by the sea. The strategic effect is immediate. Japan's ability to reinforce that front by daylight convoy takes a blow it cannot casually replace. The Southwest Pacific campaign shifts. Not because one battle wins a war, but because supply, always supply, has been cut. If you want the clean version of the story, you stop there. You end on the numbers. You call it decisive. You say the convoy was destroyed, and therefore the operation worked, and therefore the modification was justified. But war is not clean, and the men who were there carried the part that doesn't fit a clean ending. After the main fighting, the ocean is filled with survivors. Rafts. Men clinging to debris. Some rescue attempts. Some ships trying to collect their own. In this stage, the war becomes something else. Something colder. Follow-up attacks target crippled ships and, in some accounts, survivors in the water. It's the kind of detail that turns victory sour in the mouth. It forces you to acknowledge that war does not simply ask you to defeat the enemy. Sometimes it asks you to erase the enemy's ability to exist in the area at all. People argue about this part. They debate necessity and morality and context. They should. Because if you don't argue about it, if you don't let it disturb you, then you've accepted something dangerous, that the ends always justify the means. The crews who flew those missions did not have the luxury of philosophical distance. They were inside the machine. They were told the objective: ensure the convoy does not complete its mission in any form. They were told that survivors could be rescued and fight again, could land and kill Allied soldiers later. They were told that mercy now could mean blood later. And they carried those orders like stones in their stomachs. This is what people mean when they say war is brutal. Not only because it kills, but because it forces good people into situations where every option leaves a stain. Back in Australia, far from the ocean smoke, the argument over guns modifications continued, because bureaucracies don't stop being bureaucracies just because men died at sea. Messages went back and forth. Engineers studied the balance concerns. They worried about stress. They worried about the idea of endorsing a modification that appeared unsafe by textbook standards. Some wanted modified aircraft, grounded until proper testing could be done. But the frontline logic had already won. It won the only way it ever can, by proving itself in combat. After Bismarck's Sea, the strafer wasn't a wild idea. It was a doctrine in motion. Units copied it. Mechanics shared drawings informally. Gun mounts were reinforced. Blast tubes were extended. Skin around mounts was patched. Crews learned painfully what failed and what survived. The war itself became a laboratory that accepted human lives as payment for data. And in time, the factory world began to catch up. That is the strange cycle of wartime innovation. First, you improvise, then you survive. Then, if enough people survive and enough targets die, Someone in a clean office decides the improvisation should become standard. The B-25 line began to sprout variants more openly suited to the role Gunn had forced upon it. Solid noses, heavier armament, and in some versions a cannon large enough to feel absurd in an aircraft. An admission that the idea of concentrated forward fire wasn't a hack anymore. It was a recognized capability. But in the Pacific, even as factories refined designs, field modifications continued to evolve because battlefields don't wait for shipping schedules. Crews added what they needed when they needed it. Extra fuel, different ammunition loads, different gun configurations. Tactics changed with experience. How to approach, when to open fire, how to coordinate with other aircraft so defenses were overwhelmed rather than merely annoyed. The Japanese reacted too. They had to. They shifted movement tonight. They dispersed into barges and smaller craft. They hugged coastlines and hid under jungle shadows and tried to make the ocean itself a place where aircraft couldn't find them. The war became more elusive, more like hunting than fighting, and the strafers adapted, turning from a convoy killer into a general tool of pressure. Attack shipping, hit airfields, smash barges, suppress defenses, break anything that relied on open movement. If you stand far enough away, it looks like a straightforward story. A mechanic turns bombers into gunships and helps win a key battle. It's inspiring, and it should be, because ingenuity under pressure can save lives. But if you stand closer, you see the cost of that ingenuity. You see the ground crews working until their hands tremble, because the next mission goes whether the mount is perfect or not. You see pilots briefing low-level runs with a calm that's actually shock control. You see aircraft coming back with holes in them, metal torn like paper, and you realize the difference between success and catastrophe can be a single bullet through a cable you didn't even know was exposed. You see, too, how war changes what success means. Success becomes destroying a convoy so thoroughly the enemy stops trying. Success becomes making a sea route too dangerous to use. Success becomes forcing an entire theater of war to change its habits out of fear. And fear, once it becomes a tool, doesn't politely leave when the war ends. Gunn's personal story runs in parallel with all of this like a thin wire under tension. While his aircraft helped tear apart ships on the ocean, his family remained trapped in captivity. He carried that knowledge as a silent engine. It likely fueled his refusal to accept slow answers, his willingness to fly risks, his impatience with comfortable skepticism. When you are separated from your family by war, the war isn't a map. It's a wound, and a wound doesn't care about official procedures. In time, the Philippines would be liberated, and prisoners would walk out of camps as shadows of themselves. Families would reunite awkwardly because after years of hunger and fear, even recognition can take a moment. The war would grind toward its end. But by then, the strafer idea had already escaped its origin and become part of a broader shift. Aircraft were no longer only bomb droppers. They were multi-purpose killers designed to dominate the first seconds of contact. That legacy extends beyond any single aircraft model. It shows up in every later moment when militaries decide that overwhelming, forward-focused firepower can solve a tactical problem faster than careful, distant precision. It shows up in the philosophy that if you can suppress the enemy's ability to respond, you can dictate the outcome, which brings us back to Eagle Farm, and to that weld seam cooling on an A-20 nose while a man watched with the stillness of someone who had already accepted the risks. Because the real story here isn't that everyone else was stupid and Gunn was smart. The real story is that wartime forces choices that feel wrong until they feel inevitable. The engineers weren't fools. They were guardians of safety in a world where safety was disappearing. Gunn wasn't reckless. He was responding to a reality that had already killed enough people to make normal unacceptable. He took the war as it was. Dirty, unfair, fast, and he tried to bend it a few degrees toward survival. And for a while, it worked. It worked brutally. It worked decisively. It worked in a way that left wreckage on the sea and emptiness in the enemy's plans. If this kind of story is why you're here, the human decisions behind the hardware, the tactics that changed battles, and the moral weight that never fits neatly into a victory headline, take a second to support the channel. Hit like so more people actually see these deep-dive WWII stories. Subscribe if you want more episodes that focus on forgotten innovations and the people who built them under impossible pressure. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because these stories didn't belong to one country. They belong to everyone who inherited the world that came after. Now, with that said, here's the uncomfortable question the Strafer story leaves behind. Was Pappy Gunn a genius who saved lives by forcing innovation into the field before it was approved? Or is his story proof that war rewards whatever works, even when what works comes with a darker edge? Because there's a difference between admiring ingenuity and worshipping the machine that demanded it. The Bismarck Sea proved the tactical value of forward firepower and low-level attack. It helped shift a campaign. It helped deny Japan the simple act of moving troops by convoy in daylight. It likely saved Allied soldiers on the ground by preventing reinforcements from arriving. But it also demonstrated how quickly effective can become ruthless. It showed how easily the logic of war expands from sinking ships to ensuring no one escapes to fight again. It reminded everyone that a battlefield is not a courtroom. It does not weigh intentions, it counts outcomes. And perhaps that is the final legacy of Gunn's impossible gunship, not a specific number of guns or a specific aircraft variant, but the brutal clarity it brought to an air war over water. If you can dominate the approach, you can dominate the kill. If you can dominate the kill, you can dominate the supply. And if you dominate the supply, you can change the entire direction of a campaign. That chain of logic is powerful. It is also terrifying because it turns human lives into links in a system. So when you picture that early morning at Eagle Farm, the sparks, the oil smell, the man under the wing, picture it honestly. Not as a comic book origin, as a moment of necessity where someone chose to build a weapon because the alternative was to watch more people die under the old rules. War didn't make that choice noble. War made it urgent. And urgency is the most dangerous fuel ever invented. If you want the next episode, subscribe and turn on notifications. In the next story, we'll follow another impossible idea from the Pacific. One that started as a desperate workaround and ended up rewriting how air crews fought in darkness, weather, and chaos. Until then, leave your take in the comments. Genius, reckless, or both, and why?